Okay, hello everybody and welcome to the University of Hull's Alumni Masterclass on Globalisation and International Trade with Professor Christopher Bovis. I've been really looking forward to this session today because it's a subject that's very interesting and of the time. You know, how do we relate to one another and trade across international boundaries at the same time as sort of retaining our sovereignty? And that's a question obviously that very obviously has plagued us in recent times with issues such as Trump and Brexit here in Britain. Who better to help us tackle these thorny issues than the University of Hull's very own Professor Christopher Bovis, who has published extensively internationally, and I'm really delighted that you've been able to join us here today, Chris. We'll have a session with Christopher that'll last probably about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. I hope you can see the presentation. I will just hit play now, and then hopefully you can see that. Can everyone see that okay?
Yep.
Great. Okay, Chris, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, and thank you to the International Alumni Office for that great opportunity to talk to alumni. I'm one of your own students back in 1991, and I have a very special heart, very special place on my heart for the university and its people. And I've been honored to discuss with you today topics that relate into international trade and how these international trade patterns affect jurisdictions concerning, for example, national receipt of the patterns that happen into the world trade and to jurisdictions that are close to us, close to people across the world. I've been working for the university for a number of years, and also I'm doing a lot of work for international organizations, advising the compliance and regulatory issues, as well as government and national governments and industry, private sector. And I've amassed a number of experiences that relate into how international trade patterns affect national governments and how they affect national industries. The first point I would like to mention to you as a trade pattern is the globalization. Globalization and also the ability to have a number of attributes relating into the effects of globalization into the international trade. Globalization started before the millennium. Before the millennium was the number one priority of international trade policy and law that relate into free trade. Globalization is nothing more than the epitome of free trade, and no taxes or no duties to goods and services across the world. Globalization created unique opportunities for many countries. Countries that are industrialized, they're developed, and mainly they wanted to expand. They expand in growth and market share. Globalization created a new era of international trade and geopolitics. It created a massive amount of investment and patterns of investment from the West to the East. You understand the recipient beneficiary of globalization has been the Far East, specifically China, and countries around China that relate into that concept of receiving investment in order to compete, in order to create competitive forces into international trade for goods and services. Globalization had a lot of success as a policy, as a regulatory instrument, but at the same time created a huge vacuum behind that relates into domestic policy, domestic priorities of governments. The industrialized nations that they are benefited from globalization, as a side effect, witness a major vacuum, a major gap into their own jurisdictions, starting from employment, starting from investment, inward investment, and culminating into the elements of competition. Globalization domestically created less competition for industrialized nations. As a result, globalization competed with another pattern of international trade called decoupling. Globalization started working against the benefits of industrialized and developed countries and economies in a way that inshoring and repatriation of competencies were the priority and the response of many governments and many economies of industrialized nations. As a result, dependency ties that already were created for investment and also for manufacturing, they have to be reassessed and possibly cut, because the decoupling effect of the globalization, the side effects of that wonderful period of economic growth based on imports and cheap imports, started to take a toll into the industrialized nations. The dependency ties of industrial nations, industrialized economies, and developed economies with the rest of the world had to be reassessed. And they are reassessed as we speak. The priority is for the national rulemaking, the national assembly, the national legislators. It will create rules and laws that protect. Economic protectionism, it's coming, and you will see that across the world, from United States and Canada all the way to China, and vice versa. Globalization, which is based on the principle of free trade, non-tariff protection, results, unfortunately, into economic nationalism, protectionism, and tariffs to protect domestic industry, to protect employment. This is happening as we speak, and you will see tremendous impact on how national systems, how domestic jurisdictions respond to that in the years to come. The second topic, the second pattern I would like to mention to you is environment. The environment has become a pattern of trade, a priority not only for law and regulation, but a priority for developing as a public policy. The environment and the protection of the environment focuses on carbon reduction and the whole production process, including manufacturing, the cut of the dependency from fossil fuels, and the huge investment and prioritization of renewable energy. The protection of the environment also brings in the front line the cyclical economy. Not only recycling of materials, but the cyclical economy in terms of a concept which is known to everybody, but nobody has yet embraced it. The total cost of ownership. The total cost of ownership of an asset or a service between public and also private sector. The final point of the concept of the environment as a trade term is the food security. The security of food production and food distribution. Recent developments that relate into hostilities or environmental issues that relate into certain geopolitical turbulences, focus on that concept of food security and food pricing. So you will see food becoming a key priority for international trade. Not only the production of materials and the provision of services, but also the humble production and distribution of food. A third point, a third trend for international trade and how that trend is being reinforced in national administrations is the event of artificial intelligence. We have artificial intelligence, machine learning, automation, the digitization agenda between public and private sectors, and the concept called blockchain dominating international trade patterns. Artificial intelligence is progress. It's something that is not only evolutionary, but it's a progress of technology. And the application of that technology into trade patterns is imperative. Imperative to understand how we're going to collectively regulate artificial intelligence in terms of content, in terms of application, and in terms of side effects. Artificial intelligence is the epitome of the fourth revolution, the fourth industrial revolution across the world. It takes away from the previous spectrums of revolution that you have for technology, for processes, from bureaucracy all the way to automation, into something which is completely digitized. We have digital currency. We have a completely different agenda for payment systems, which is part of the contract. For any contract to release its terms and conditions, there must be a payment. Now for payments, we can have a digital currency, something that doesn't exist in reality, but it's somewhere outside the remit. Therefore, artificial intelligence becomes a number one priority for many countries to regulate, but the problem is the regulation has to be uniform. How United States regulates artificial intelligence must be in a uniform manner with how UK or how Europe, how European countries, or how the Far East, how China, Japan, and how developing nations regulate artificial intelligence. This is and that is a mountain to climb. A fourth pattern on international trade focuses on innovation. Innovation as part of research and development, intellectual property, social innovation, design processes that lead to innovation, the demand side of the innovation that relates into who creates the innovation and who creates the environment for innovation, the public sector, the government, as the recipient often for innovation in the delivery of public services. And finally, the marketplace, the workplace, as a potential ground for innovation. You hear a lot of promises from governments, from international organizations and institutions that we need to innovate. We need to create different ways of doing things, not for the purposes of innovating, not for the purposes of saying that we have innovation as a process of our life, but the outcome of innovation is efficiency, something that many governments or many institutions do not come clean into that concept. Innovation brings efficiencies. That means cheaper prices. Innovation will realize a completely different model for the production process in terms of direct costs, indirect costs, overheads, margins that they're applicable to companies for profitability and distribution of profits to shareholders. Innovation is the completely rewriting of the book of industrial production. It is also embedded into the fourth industrial revolution. It's part and parcel of that concept of moving the expectations and the delivery process in a different way, in a different manner forwards. That leads me into another important pattern that you will see coming more and more in our lives as we progress into this century and this decade specifically. I'm referring to disruption. Disruption is endemic in many sectors and many industries. Disruption is intending to displace a market, displace an industry, or displace technology existing. Disruption offers efficiency and creativity. Disruption, however, needs technology regulation. And often, disruption is based on IT offers. The progress and the ability to incorporate IT offerings into the production process will lead to the disruption. Disruptions often in many sectors result into industrial reorganization. From the aviation sector, from transport sector, from service delivery, from manufacturing process. A disruption process benefits the consumer. The consumer also is the recipient of disruption by having a different way of receiving the outcomes of a sector. Therefore, disruption is to be welcomed. Disruption is to be embraced by governments and by also the society as part of the technological revolution of a sector or an industry. That leads me into another topic that relates into the trade pattern that is very common in many regions in the world. Investment and divestment. You remember when I started speaking to you today, my first point was about the globalization effects, the ability to have free trade, not only for goods, but services. And within services, there's one concept called capital. Capital is free to move. That means the investment environment is guaranteed as part of globalization. Public or private sectors can invest in different parts of the world because of free movement of capital, freedom to invest. The investment has one concept, the anticipation of return, hopefully profitability, but mainly market share. The investment creates the opportunities for increasing market shares. market shares of sectors and domestic industries. Industries that their need to either protect their market share or increase it. The last 25, 30 years, the wave of globalization witnessed a phenomenal amount of investment from the West to the East, from United States and Canada, all the way to China and the dragons of the East. That is part of the whole concept of the investment treaties. Under the United Nations, under many European institutions, that flow of capital, portfolio investments, direct investment, indirect investment, created the environment for maintaining that expectation of profitability and increasing market share of the sectors that they invested. The investee and the investor benefited at the same time. The opposite side effects of investment focus also on the possibility to divest. If capital is about to move free as part of the investment strategy, then it's possible that capital should be able to divest from a market or a specific location to find better opportunities, to find better challenges. That's the essence of capitalism. That's the essence of modern Western world and economies, which is embracing many actions and many designs, institutional designs of regulatory frameworks. China and the BRICS countries are recipients of huge investment patterns in assets and infrastructure. Africa, as we speak, has reversed the possibility of investment into divestment from these countries. China and BRICS invest in Africa, in assets and infrastructure. You will see the West moves into the East. Now the East moves into Africa, the great continent for investment. The pattern is quite cyclical. It relates into fossil fuels. Everything under the ground is the recipient of investment. The wealth, the natural reserves and natural resources of many states are attracting investment. And the outcome of that cycle is divestment. It moves away. Capital moves away. Like the migratory bird moves away from one country or from region to another. That brings me into another topic, another specific pattern that is currently the number one priority of many institutions and many governments across the world, the big tech corporates. The topic that the technology companies, a number of companies that they oligopolize the market, have created a kind of stronghold on governments and also the market itself, including consumers. The big tech companies focusing on information and communication technologies, artificial intelligence, automation, everything that relates into the functioning of everyday life sectors and industries are needed in order to function, to create the function priorities for many sectors in the world. As a result of that, the big tech companies need regulation, separate regulation that the small company or the national company, the big tech company, doesn't recognize borders. It doesn't recognize physical borders or regional borders. It can be anywhere. It doesn't have to be present in the earth. It could be in the cloud. You understand the concept of that? You don't have to have a physical presence in the country if you're a big tech company. You can move around because that is the concepts of internationalizations and also new technologies allowing the seat of a company to be outside the earth. And the benefit of that is that taxation and taxes, the epitome of sharing the success story from corporates, evaporates. The big tech companies don't pay taxes. You heard about the huge debate that we had in Europe and in other parts of the world about fair taxes. The big tech companies create not only very complex management structures and systems, but also they provide that argument in the tax authority that because they don't have a seat, they don't have a residence into a specific state for the physical services they provide, they cannot be taxed. They cannot be taxed to the point that they get huge amounts of revenue, more or less tax-free. The big tech companies create monopoly power, something that competition rules across the world realize to the point that the big tech companies cannot be regulated under traditional antitrust, under traditional dominant position and monopoly position rules that exist since the beginning of the 1900s. We need a different approach. We need different ideas about how the oligopoly of the technology companies can be regulated in the environment. In addition to the challenges that the big tech companies bring into the marketplace and the governments and the society at large, we witness tremendous amount of problems, socioeconomic problems that are as the result of trade wars. Not only warfare, not only the ability to have friction between states, as we see recently in different parts of the world, mainly in Europe and North Africa at the moment, but the possibility for other war friction is everywhere. But the trade war, the economic war, is always present, is underlying any geopolitical, any diplomatic relationship. Trade wars are hostility between partners that under even globalization, they have a tremendous environment of antipathy, economic antipathy, and clash. Clash about market access, tariffs, and basically protectionism. You heard from me before that protectionism, it's the anathema of globalization. Globalization doesn't like protectionism. But without protectionism, the regional economy, the regional priority cannot flourish. Without protectionism, without duties and tariffs, the national governments will have a major problem in their hands in taking the benefits of globalization from one part of the equation and having very little to offer on the other hand of the equation, which is the domestic performance for industries, for the society, for even the consumers. The tariff is always the last resort in trade wars. The tariff is the ability of national governments to equalize the side effects of globalization, create something that brings more fair play, something that creates more opportunities for domestic sections of the economy or sectors. Who determines that? It's the national government. It's the national policy that needs to dictate the ability of a government or a region in the world to enact trade war. Unfortunately, we witnessed the last 5 years an underlying economic hostility between the United States, Canada, and China, to the point that it was an open warfare, economic warfare, in terms of taxes, in terms of duties, and in terms of limiting access. That economic warfare is spread into Europe now. The European Union, not part of the UK, was not part of the European, it was part of the European Union before, but not anymore, is bringing measures that relate into controlling interests of companies in Europe by foreign interests in order to create that balance, that element of fair play. And they're focusing on one player, one economic player, and that is the Far East, that's China. Because the result of globalization indicates that the European firms, the North American firms, cannot compete on price. They cannot compete on infrastructure, on critical infrastructure or material, on specific commodities that are necessary for transport, for energy. Therefore, they require measures that relate into equalizing the field, increasing tariffs, going against globalization, in other words. And it's imperative. It's imperative to understand the consequences of that. You will see the differences. One hand tells everybody free trade, globalization, equal opportunities for everybody. The other hand tells the word protection. Protection on the part of priorities of regions or governments. As a result of that concept of trade wars, the hostility between the West and the East, mainly, we have tremendous rewriting of the concept called geopolitics. We witness the creation of trade blocs, blocks of countries that exist in different parts of the world. They have common interests between them, but also they have a common denominator in terms of economic growth, priorities, and also potential emerging economies. Economies that relate into moving away from developing to developed status. That's important here. I'd like to bring you back when we were studying years ago. And the idea was that the trajectory of nations and economies always has been between developing countries, which should be protected, towards developed status, creating that concept of a leap of faith, moving away from the developing nation in need of constant protection, prioritization, into a fully grown, developed nation, an economy that requires nothing else but other than taxes on the part of international systems and national systems. We witness now the emergence of the emerging economy. You heard of that? You heard the ability to have something between developing and developed nations. The emerging economy outperforms many developed nations. The emerging economy takes into account disruption, innovation, technology, and creates a differing offering for international trade. Emerging markets appear often in different parts of the world, but there is a cluster, very, very useful cluster to study and research and practice. Emerging markets of the Far East, Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong in the past when it was part of that transition, Vietnam currently, Indonesia, Philippines. That cluster creates a unique opportunity to study and see the performance of these economies vis-a-vis developed nations, vis-a-vis economies that they're mature, and in the past and currently still rely on the wave of globalization, the wave of opportunities of free trade to maintain the status of developed economy. That brings together geopolitics, not only the economic performance, but the creation of blocks in different parts of the globe. And United States and Canada and Mexico. Traditionally, we had the competing trading bloc to the European Union bloc called the NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Area, that created something quite promising. However, it didn't materialize. It didn't materialize because of short-sighting, myopia, diplomatic and also economic myopia. A mentor of mine, Peter Knosson, a legendary commentator of international trade, mentioned to me that the serious defect of international trade partners in North America was an auto-pack agreement, an agreement between the United States and Canada and Mexico that relate into the automotive production and manufacturing. And the short-sighted effects out of that concept is also the grounding effect of why NAFTA didn't create the opportunities to have that concept of fully fledged, quasi-federal, economically federal system in international trade. On the contrary, the European Union created something different, something that created geopolitics based on the internal market. The European Union has no barriers, has no borders, free trade, glorified free trade, no taxes, direct or indirect, between countries. That is the opposite effect. That's the opposite effect of two comparative elements of geopolitics and priorities of different nations and different blocks, trading blocks. Finally, as a concluding effect of international patterns recognition, I'd like to mention the role of international organizations. We have many international organizations that are specifically relate to trade, business in other words. The World Trade Organization, the epitome of the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, the umbrella that creates free trade and the principles of free trade and movement of goods and services. The United Nations, the umbrella organization that doesn't look after only the ability to regulate the relations between states, but also create tremendous amounts of regulatory instruments for investment, services, recognition, even arbitral or non-arbitral awards. These organizations penetrate directly national jurisdictions to the point that they become law, to the point that they become tremendously embedded into legal structures of individual member states. The International Monetary Foundation, the IMF, the eye in the sky concerning compliance with regulatory environments for fiscal policy. NATO. Finally, the importance of NATO as part of the celebration of peace across the world. That is a concept that also provides that relevance in terms of trade blocs across the world. The World Trade Organization, the United Nations, the IMF, the European Union, NATO are prioritizing trade, not relations between countries or blocs. The priority now is trade, is business, it's economic growth. Everything else is relevant, but not the priority. So you will see that concept in terms of how geopolitics evolve around governance, a model that relates into a trustee of international relations, a trusteeship of international relations based on that concept of governance. And the result of that is the epitome of regional trade. The relevance of trading blocs and the ability to have all the above international organizations emanate the last point of my presentation to you today. Regional trade, trade between regions. And this is the outcome of the globalization trip. From free trade across the world, we arrive at the next generation of policy orientation, which is regional trade, the ability of regions between themselves to grow, to create economic activity, and to create economic growth for the citizens, for the society, and mainly to reap the benefit of a tariff-free production process for goods and services. That's the epitome of that regional trade patterns and how the international organizations focus today for everybody's choice. I'd like to thank you profoundly for coming today. I'd like to thank you for listening to me about these 10 topics of international trade patterns and how they're being received by many jurisdictions. Eventually, I would like to welcome you in campus. You come back into your alma mater and you see how much we created in terms of presence, in research, in teaching, in investment in infrastructure. What is our alma mater, the University of Hull? I look forward to shake your hands and see you when you come there. And also to see you personally and also find out what you're doing, how you can profess your expertise in different parts of the world into your different marketplace. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for listening. And thank you to the Alumni Office for creating this great opportunity for me today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was a really fascinating talk. I feel like my brain has grown several sizes to try and taking what was a lot of information, and there's so much for us to dig into there. So I'm really looking forward to opening up to questions from the audience. In fact, thank you also for being so welcoming to our alumni as well, and sort of keeping that spirit of welcome that we have with our graduates. We have a few questions that have already come in through the chat. There are two ways that people can put the questions to Chris. You can either write it in the meeting chat, and I'll then put that question to Chris, or if you want to raise your hand using the there's a raise your hand icon at the top of the screen, and then we can maybe come to you and you can put your question briefly to Chris. As I say, Chris, there was so much there that we could dig into. I think one of the things that Anita pulled out initially was regarding the AI laws, and she wondered if you could provide some examples of legislations across different countries. She pointed out that you mentioned that AI laws need to sort of be in unison. I guess there needs to be that sort of similarities between the ways that the different countries regulate AI, and she's wondering if you've got some examples of legislation across different countries.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the question. Very topical question. I do have issues with countries that they do not regulate artificial intelligence. They leave everything away from regulating to receiving artificial intelligence into the marketplace at the detriment of the consumer. And the reason for that is twofold. First is that some countries or some economies need artificial intelligence more than others. They need that concept of bringing the whole production process in a way that it's materially competent to compete with other parts of the world. In other words, automation. I refer to a country, very, very familiar country called China. China is a place that is the background of innovation. It's a background for investment. It's a background for artificial intelligence in terms of processes of automation and also processes of using a machine learning. You're aware of that concept in terms of the whole production process that traditionally dominated an industry. Not only automation, but also the whole concept of legal implications of that. I refer to the concept of blockchain. In a few years' time, in certain parts of the world, including China, mainly China, we won't need the contract. We won't need that concept of the sort of contract, the paper, the written signature, the wet signature that is authenticating the terms and conditions of the contract. And the reason for that is because we will have blockchain. We'll have something which is owned by the two parties somewhere in the web or somebody in the cloud. And you can see exactly the performance of these two parties, deducting or subtracting at the same time the outcomes, the payment. That is something that we need to learn. The Western press, Europe, UK, United States, Canada need to learn about that concept of regulating artificial intelligence and also be more proactive and more provocative, if I may say, curtailing artificial intelligence. There's a lot of appetite by many jurisdictions to prohibit artificial intelligence, to create a concept of not only regulating, but controlling negatively the effect of artificial intelligence into the production process, not only to preserve employment patterns, but also to preserve efficacy or to preserve fairness or whatever they perceive as ethics and fairness. There is an example in Europe at the moment to regulate artificial intelligence, specifically clauses in contracts based on artificial intelligence. I'll give you an example. Financial services, investment. You know, the investment pattern, the last 10, 15 years, just shortly after the millennium, investment patterns point out to an artificial intelligence, a machine learning platform that does nothing else but assess automatically from a risk point of view where to invest. Not humans, no pair of eyes or no brains are involved. Everything is done by an algorithm. to the point of accuracy, which is phenomenally different than any other accuracy investment strategy or investment practice you will see across the world. Most of the pension funds, most of the risk investments are done by a computer, by an artificial intelligence. That is what's happening now. And that is also what's happening in terms of different payment systems. It will be interesting to see, for example, how the acceptance of digital currency, or as they call it, cryptocurrency, becomes the norm for investment. Many countries accepted the digital currency or the cryptocurrency as legitimate currency, but some created the concept of assetization of the digital currency. They don't recognize it as a currency, but as an asset. A currency and an asset is different here. China, for example, completely has a different idea about what currency is and what an asset is. I'll give you another example about the role of artificial intelligence and also receipt of that concept in the marketplace by certain countries. Financial services sector, again, a concept called shorting. Shorting a process of a company or shorting a process of a stock, shares. Many jurisdictions, many laws prohibit short selling, naked or non-naked short selling. That means institutions or banks or hedge funds cannot short the stock of a company with a view to lower the price or land the price expectations for a company or a sector. Shorting prohibits shorting. But other countries, other industrialized nations allow shorting to the point that it's become norm. It's a kind of a next normal function of a hedge fund. So you will see that concept of different countries embracing technology, innovation, artificial intelligence, automation, financial innovation differently. Do they have a different perception in protectionism? Probably yes. But they have a completely different agenda. Behind that concept of blockchain, short selling, there is, or anything else that relates into that old versus new debate in terms of technology, becomes a priority agenda of certain countries, certain regions, certain economies. The UK has a tremendous priority in balancing expectations concerning performance. There are certain countries and certain other countries in Europe that they have a different set of priorities. They have priorities that relate into net zero. They're obsessed with net zero to the point that they want a complete detachment from fossil fuels. Electric vehicles, everything electrically operated, therefore no power stations other than creation of energy via turbines, wind turbines or other non-fossil generation power plants. So you will see again the national priority epitomizes that concept of how a member state or an economy or a legal system is projecting protectionism or concepts that relate into issues that focus on free trade. I'm trying to get as many questions as possible into my little address to there. I've seen so much interesting topics about your questions that you have for me as well, and also for the topics I mentioned to you. What we need to do mainly is we need to keep in touch. We need to keep in touch in terms of not only the alumni, but also the professional part of yours, your academic or your professional, your business or your civic service or your everything that you do, and bring together a group, bring together a concept that relates into dissemination of material and dissemination of ideas and policies that they're relevant today. The world is moving so fast and so differently than other decades that I think it's going to be very beneficial for even governments across the world to take notice of what people say, what the consumer, what the citizens say about these concepts for globalization, for artificial intelligence, for mainly investment patterns, because the world has changed so much, so the investment is completely different. Investment patterns relate into different periods of investment, not decades, but perhaps months. It's possible now to have a very short investment period. Not only the longevity of investment is part of the equation, but also short-termism. The flipping elements of investment is here to stay. We see that in Africa. We see that in other parts of the world, in Mexico also, in the other side of the world. So the world is changing fast, and we need to also embrace that change. Not be afraid of that, but embrace that and get the best out of that. Thank you for the comments. Thank you for everything you put on your screen. And we're celebrating a few major events at the university, and the alumni will keep you, alumni office will keep you in touch. It will keep you informed of that. Sometime I would love to see you in person and shake hands and continue the debate. Thank you again. Thank you for everything.
Chris, thank you very much. Thank you. That was wonderful. I think that's a really good place to leave, especially on that sort of sentiment of embracing change, and also making the most of our network and coming together, and our shared expertise as well as alumni, and also the academics of the University of Hull, which obviously the Alumni Masterclass has attempted to make experts such as yourself available to our graduates. So we're very grateful that you've shared your time with us this afternoon, and again, very grateful to everybody else who has joined us. I know that we're getting close now to the hour mark, so people might have other things that they've got to go on to do, and I know you're a very busy man as well, Chris. But yeah, I think now is a great time to say thank you very much, and to wish everybody a good rest of the day.